Hey, my name is Gaia Athena, and in this video, I'm bringing you part 2 of my 2020 reading statistics. We get to gender of author, and I find it interesting that the amount of male authors that I've been reading has kind of been in decline over the years. Now, of course, the amount of books actually read is different, so in that sense, it's not been in decline as much, but I mean, percentually, is that even a word? And the amount of female authors kind of goes up and down, but at least the last few years, I have been reading more female authors than male authors. And also, since 2017, I have read a couple of books each year by authors who are non-binary or of other genders. And then in 2020, we have a large block, 30 books, that is unknown. So I wasn't able to look that up and such. So I'm classing that as unknown. I would like to actually read more books written by non-binary authors or authors who are other genders. Then we get to new versus familiar authors. So the blue is new authors, the orange is familiar authors, and the grey is a combination. Combination is usually if a book is written by more than one author and I'm familiar with one author but not with the other or something like that. I should point out that this is on a per book basis. So if I read one book by an author that year and the author is new to me, then for that first book they are classified as a new author. But if I read a second book from them that year, then they are classified as a familiar author because I've read a book from them before, if that makes sense. I would like to also do this on a per author basis, but I haven't quite figured out statistically how I can do that. So this is on a per book basis. And as you can see, in 2013, I read a lot more new to me authors. And over the years, I am reading a bit more familiar authors. I tried out quite a few new authors once I became a member of the library. But then, if I found new authors I liked, and I did find quite a few, I then went on to borrow other books by them from the library. So I think that's why in 2015, 2016, just over 80% of my reading was by familiar authors because I was going to the library and get the next book in the series sort of thing. In 2020, it's been about 30% new authors and then 70, well, almost 70-ish familiar authors. Now we get to standalone versus series. So the blue is standalone, the orange is series, and the grey is a combination. Now a combination I use mostly for when a book has the same characters, let's say, or like takes place in the same world, but it's not necessary to read all of the books before it. Like each book is kind of its separate standalone story. For example, the Geronimo Stilton main series, it's like a new story each book. So most of these combinations, I think, are children's books in which you don't have to necessarily read all of those that came before it to enjoy the new story. So I have classed some of those as combinations. I did read a lot of children's book in 2015, 2016 also, but back then I hadn't realized I hadn't classified much yet as combination, so the series are quite high in those 2 years because I read a lot of like children's book. I discovered Diary with a Wimpy Kid, for example, and lots of other children's books, Stiltons as well. I read a lot of Stiltons in 2015, 2016, and I classified them as series at the time. But in 2020, I gravitated a bit more towards standalones. In comparison to, let's say, 2019. And it looks like it's actually, well, almost 50-50, but then, yeah, the combination, if you combine combination and series. I have been feeling a bit reluctant to start, like, new series, because I'm already in the middle of, like, so many, and so I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I gravitated more towards standalones. But yeah. I do like both. I am someone who quickly gets like series burnout, author burnout, genre burnout. So I try to switch up my reading. So let's say I read a let's say adult fantasy, then after that I usually want to read something else. But of course with series that in which it's actually necessary to read like all the books in order, I don't want to leave too much time between the books, because otherwise I will totally forget what happened or what the characters' names were and stuff like that. I guess I've been preferring standalones more often lately. But anyway, now we get to genres. And yeah, this is going to take a little bit more time to explain, I guess. So the blue bar, the bottom one, is fantasy. Then we have orange, science fiction. Grey, contemporary fiction. Then we have rom-com, historical fiction, literature, detective and mystery, thriller, horror, paranormal, biography, memoir, information, Disney and art. Although those last two, I don't read a whole lot from them. Disney is... I made that category when I started to read quite a few of Donald Duck Pockets. But in 2020, I didn't read any of that. And art, I only read in 2019 one book, I think. So, but yeah, the rest of the genres, my reading has evolved over the years. Well, so some of the things I noticed is that I read a lot of information books in 2013, percentage-wise, but less so in the years following that, especially after like in 2016 and on. I personally feel that has to do as well with the fact that I graduated in 2013, and then I kind of started to feel like, well, I've learned a lot now, you know, university and before that high school, that I started to become, well, less interested is maybe not the right word, but my brain really needed to recover, and so I didn't feel as much of a need to read information books. I prefer to read more fiction sort of thing. However, I did start to read a lot more memoirs throughout the years. So as you can see, memoir is kind of the dark blue, and starting 2017 up to now, that's quite a bit of a portion of my reading, and I have really been enjoying that the past few years. Well, the fantasy kind of differs a bit. Science fiction stays relatively, well, similar in terms of percentages. Though in terms of actual books, of course, that differs a lot. Contemporary fiction, I have been reading a lot. It's one of my favorite genres, and you can see, especially like 2013, it was not lots yet, and even 2014. But like after that, I started to read a lot of that. And I have found out it's one of my favorite genres. So, rom-com has been declining a bit the past few years. Now, this is kind of what some people call chick lit, but it is also some children's books like The Babysitter's Club that I classify under that. And I reread quite a few of the Babysitter's Club books, like in those earlier years, not so much in the past few years. In 2020, I read quite a few thrillers, though I think the majority of those, 13 to be precise, is the Death Note manga, which I counted as a thriller and fantasy, I believe. So, yeah, that's why that percentage thriller is a bit high. For most of the years, I read some thrillers each year, but not lots in comparison to some of the other genres. And the same is for detective and mystery, literature, historical fiction, paranormal and horror. And then here we have the same data about genres, but then this time it is plotted using the actual amount of books read and not in percentages. So this, I thought it would be interesting to also show this, because this is like in absolute numbers, if that makes sense. And then we get to the last graph of this part, and that is fiction versus non-fiction. So it's a bit similar to the genres, but then it's showing fiction and non-fiction. And then grey is again a combination. I read the past few years, I've read a couple of books which were both like a story, but also had lots of information, if that makes sense. So those are then classified as combination. So for me, non-fiction is information books as well as memoirs. and books like self-help are classified as information books. So those are kind of the two genres that I consider non-fiction. And fiction, well, is of course everything fictional. So kind of all the other genres for me that I used to classify in. The memoirs are making me read more non-fiction lately, whereas in the early days it was more information. In 2015 and 16, I didn't read that much non-fiction because I went to the library then and I tended to borrow more fiction books and not lots of non-fiction. When I was a kid, though, I read a lot of both. When I was a kid, my local library at the time, I believe, allowed, with my children's subscription, you were allowed to borrow, I don't know, 4 fiction books and 4 non-fiction books. And I think, or 8, or, well, I can't remember the exact number, okay? But me being a huge reader, I wanted to borrow as many books as I can. So I would borrow the maximum amount, which is, let's say, 4 fiction books, 4 non-fiction books. So I read both. And then later on, I got what was called at the time a star subscription, which meant I could borrow twice as much. I think it was like 8 fiction books and 8 non-fiction books. But I could be wrong with the numbers. This was a long time ago. But so back then, I got to read more if I also borrowed non-fiction books, sort of thing. And as a kid, I really wanted to know a lot about how the world works. So I read a lot of non-fiction books, information books, about many subjects. Anyway, that was kind of a bit of a tangent. This was the end of part 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in my next video. Part 3 should be up soon. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!